This panel has the clever and relatively meaningless title of Social Issues, which means it's a bunch of people talking about things I think will be interesting that I'm not sure I can come up with a more narrow description for, but things involving the social concerns that these technology will bring. I would note that I think the social issues will depend enormously on whether it is another screening technology that needs to be followed up with amniocentesis or CVS, or whether it ultimately becomes a diagnostic technology. I suspect its implications will be much greater if or when it becomes a diagnostic technology. But having said that, let me turn things over to the panel.
Okay.
We'll start with Will Saletan.
So, where's my clicker?
It was not Susan Kelly.
All right, so that'll get me forward. Yeah, that's it. Okay. All right. So, I'm actually going to run a timer on myself so that Hank doesn't have to jerk my chain here. Okay. So, I got the sort of social political part of this, and I should say that I'm just a journalist, so I know less than anybody here, but I'll try to learn more than everybody while I'm here. I've used to cover politics, and then I went to cover science, and then they've dragged me back to covering politics, but I've tried to take some of the good of science with me, which is to actually have information against which you can falsify and check hypotheses, which, as you know, in political punditry is virtually absent. So what I've tried to do today is to bring to bear some data from the political world, a lot to use public opinion to frame some of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, this is my lineup of just looking at what I've read about this topic in terms of the politics of these issues and where things are going to go with it. You have a whole bunch of interests that are lined up in favor of pursuing this testing as far as it can be accomplished. Obviously, parents, everybody who has a child is interested in this. Patient groups interested in particular diseases, which were enormously influential in the stem cell fight and continue to be so. The industry, some representatives we've had today, and other industries that will be doing therapeutic work based on the diagnostic stuff that we've been talking about. The insurance industry, enormously interested in cost savings, and the government, which is the ultimate cost saver insofar as Medicaid funds a lot of this stuff. So then the question is, with all these interests lined up in favor of the testing, what's to stand in the way? What would prevent it from going forward? In the US, the answer is, we just heard the European answer where the abortion laws are fairly liberal and the abortion politics is different. Here, abortion is the issue that tends to dominate the entire political conversation, and new issues that come in, like stem cells, are interpreted through that lens. So this is some polling data this is a Gallup poll, and I just flagged in red the key thing. You can see a lineup there of different reasons why a woman might come in for an abortion, and at the very low end, you have sort of whatever the woman, whatever her reasons are, on demand, or if she can't afford the child, it may appall many people in the room, but that's taken as sort of the on-demand version of abortion. Most people don't approve of that morally, but as you can see, physical or mental impairment gets you in the, it's about 50% in this poll, but I put in their prior years, it was in the 50s. And if you look at the next poll, Fox News poll, same thing, it gets you into the low 50s. So a defect in the fetus is considered a pretty good reason for an abortion. It'll get you a majority of the country just barely. If you go on to sex selection, you'll see that that goes way down. Now, this is a pro-life organization that just did this poll, but I can tell you I've seen lots of data on sex selection, and it's very much like this. People overwhelmingly don't think it should be legal. It's just the kind of issue nobody thinks it'll happen. I would never do something like that. That's just not even. And plus, there's an anti-feminist aspect when you bring in that. So it's very highly unpopular. So when we get to this fetal sex testing, that's going to come into play. It's one of the least popular reasons for any kind of screening. Here we're getting away from abortion, and we're looking at the this is a question from the Genetics and Public Policy Center. And so now we're actually talking about prenatal genetic testing and PGD. This is relatively old data, 2004. I was actually disappointed that I didn't see a lot of more recent data on all of these, on these issues. And in fact, there definitely needs to be, you people who have any funding control, there needs to be more research on public opinion on this. But what this shows you is the basic lineup of different reasons for which you could do a prenatal genetic test or PGD. And you can see that as we move along from the therapeutic to the sort of enhancement-oriented or the trivial, the cosmetic, things that people don't think are medical conditions, like being a girl, you can see the numbers go head down. Interestingly, in this survey, you can see that across the board, oh, I should mention that Democrats score about 10 or 12 points higher across the board than Republicans on every one of these. And in the case of PGD, it's about 9 points higher. But what you'll notice is the approval is actually higher for the prenatal testing than for the PGD, which surprised me. My guess is that what that's telling you is that the way the question was asked, people are not thinking about the termination. They're thinking about the testing per se. So if they saw it as an abortion question, all these numbers would be a lot lower than they are. But they don't see it as an abortion question. But this just shows you the spectrum and the decline as you go into less significant conditions. This is, now what happens if we take that spectrum that I just showed you, the declining approval for reasons as they become less significant, and we combine it with a question that asks, and now the person's going to have an abortion, what do you think about that? And this is a survey that sort of tries to answer that question. Again, the organization, this is a pro-life organization, as with the sex selection poll, and the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and you can see they actually asked this survey after they did the focus groups. And what happens is they do the focus groups, then they figure out, they're going to release the survey, and they ask the question the way they think based on the focus group they're going to get the best results for them politically. So you can see, I mean, there's obvious things like they've stuffed the question full of developing child, and they've made sure that it's you're aborting a girl because you wanted a boy, and they're really loading the question, but still, they've sort of lined up the options, and here you've got just a narrow majority for allowing the abortion in the case where it's a fatal defect, and then they give you the non-fatal option, and you only get 20%. So this poll tries to make the case that most of the public would be against this testing used for abortions. That's the case, all right? Now, I'm going to argue that that's not true, that doesn't take into account several structural factors about this technology and the culture around it and how we use it. The first thing is that there's a multiplicity of conditions that can be tested, and as we heard earlier today, there's a business logic, there's a patient logic to doing, insofar as you're not impairing the precision of the test, and that was a separate question. We're already testing for this, that, and the other thing. Why not add this too if it can be done without harming the accuracy of the test? So now you're having to bundle it and look at it all together, and it makes it harder to take it apart. There's the ambiguity of the purpose of the test. Even if we're, as we were just discussing about sex testing, we're going to do the sex testing for an X-linked condition. Do we know? You tell the couple that it's a girl. Do you know why they subsequently went in for the abortion? You don't really know that. So it's very difficult for regulators to restrict. I mean, the regulators are restricting the noun. They're restricting the test for this condition. And it's very hard for them to restrict the subtle application of exactly which application. The third thing that makes it difficult to resist this technology is the severability of abortion from testing. Okay, so in that poll that I just showed you from the Ethics and Public Policy Center, they asked whether the couple should be allowed to have the abortion, not whether they should be allowed to have the test. And I'm going to bet you that in the focus group, it was made quite clear to them that if they asked that question about the test, they wouldn't get a majority on their side. So they asked it about the abortion. But the problem is you can't, that makes it very difficult to oppose the test per se when the person on the pro-choice side of this debate can basically say, look, we're not talking, they're asking for the information. It's just an informational test, and that whether they do something else with it is a separate issue. Okay, the fourth factor that makes it difficult to stop this is the imprecision of regulation. So, and we, so the FDA will approve a technology, and everybody here knows, right? You have, the FDA approves a drug for a particular condition, and then we develop what's known as off-label use. The FDA never approved the pill for such and such, but now people start using it that way. And that's, that's like the way two feet move together to walk from an approved purpose to an unapproved one. So, and then the fifth problem that these folks, the resistors, run into is the diffuseness of the commerce, and that is that these tests are much easier to use, much easier to get to, direct-to-consumer sales. We just saw evasion of national regulations through international sales, and this bypasses all of the gatekeepers, including doctors, counselors, and law enforcement. Okay, so this next slide is a little bit of polling data designed to sort of get at the difficulty of getting around those structural factors. Okay, this is a question from Virginia Commonwealth University and was asked about genetic engineering. So it's not really the right data, but it's the best I could do because it combines, I use this because it combines it with the abortion data. What you'll see at the top is that a majority opposes the changing the baby's genetic characteristics to reduce the risk of serious diseases. But if you then look at the abortion question, 37% of the people say that abortion should be legal no matter what the woman's reason is, okay? And then you get 43% who say it should sometimes be legal. Now, the way the math actually works is if you have a bunch of people in a country who think, look, leave these choices up to families, period. I don't want the government getting in there and messing around on the reasons. You get all of those people. Those people don't like the whole idea of going in and trying to pick and choose reasons on the part of the government. And then you also get some of the people who say that abortion should sometimes be legal, so that you can end up mathematically with a pro-choice majority that contradicts that polling data that says, well, I don't like that particular reason. Because a bunch of people who say they don't like that reason, they're just pro-choice regardless, and you'll get them on your side. Okay, this is, do I have time to do this? Yes. I got a little bit of time. Okay, I want to show you Rick Santorum. Let's see if I can, how do I pull up the, this? Can I do this? Let's see. Oh, I can go down to there, okay. All right, perfect. Great. All right, I'm going to play this. Hank asked me the question, how is this going to play out? And I watched this clip, and this is how it's going to play out. This is how it is already playing out, because as we know, we already have prenatal genetic testing. It's just at a later stage. And Rick Santorum decides that he's going to test the conservative side of this argument, and he's going to run up against Bob Schieffer, who's going to make the argument on the other side. Let's see if we can get it.
At another stop in Columbus, you took on the president on prenatal care for expectant mothers. Here's what you said in this passage.
One of the things that you don't know about Obamacare and one of the mandates is they require free prenatal testing in every insurance policy in America. Why? Because it saves money in healthcare. Why? Because free prenatal testing ends up in more abortions and therefore less care that has to be done, because we cull the ranks of the disabled in our society.
Okay, so he's hit all the buttons, right? He's given the pro-life argument, he's given the disability argument, he's trying to line up all the political arguments on the other side.
Senator, I have to ask you to give some explanation of that. You sound like you're saying that the purpose of prenatal care is to cause people to have abortions, to get more abortions in this country. I think there are any number of testing. I think any number of people would say that's not the purpose at all. Okay, so what Schieffer's saying is, look, we're not talking about abortion, we're talking about prenatal care. That's the overarching frame. When you're doing prenatal testing, you know, there are all sorts of, it's a medical enterprise, and it completely changes the politics of it, and it puts Santorum on the back foot for the rest of the interview.
Well, that's, Bob, that's simply not true. The bottom line is that a lot of prenatal tests are done to identify deformities in utero, and the customary procedure is to encourage abortions. And in fact, prenatal testing that particularly amniocentesis. I'm not talking about general prenatal care. You said prenatal care. I didn't say prenatal care shouldn't be covered. We're talking about specifically prenatal testing and specifically amniocentesis, which is a procedure that actually creates a risk of having a miscarriage when you have it, and is done for.
By the way, that thing about creating the risk is going to become an argument later on in favor of the earlier testing, right? But what Santorum keeps having to say is many times, most times, a lot of times, right? He keeps having to try to reconnect the essential connection between the testing and the abortion, and it's really difficult for him.
For the purposes of identifying maladies of a child in the womb, in which in many cases, and in fact most cases, physicians recommend, particularly if there's a problem, recommend abortion. We know, Bob, that 90% of Down syndrome children in America are aborted. So to suggest where does that come from, I have a child who has trisomy 18. Almost 100% of trisomy 18 children are encouraged to be aborted. So I know what I'm talking about here.
Well, I know you know what you're talking about. I know that well. I know you also had another child that was stillborn. But
and I was,
didn't you want to know about this? Just a minute. Well, just hold on.
Okay, they're going to go on and argue for a little bit here about sort of, you know, whether the kid was stillborn or not. But Schieffer says, didn't you want to know? And here you have Santorum, a parent who went through the genetic testing, and Santorum is going to complain that the counselor told him to get the abortion. But Santorum didn't get the abortion, right? And so he is like a living denial of the essential connection between the testing and the abortion.
Well, look, my child was not stillborn. My child was born alive.
All right.
And he lived 2 hours. And by the way, prenatal testing was, we had a sonogram done there, and they detected a problem. And yes, the doctor said, you know, you should consider an abortion. This is typical, Bob. This is what goes on in medical rooms around the country. And yes, prenatal testing, amniocentesis, does in fact result more often than not in this country in abortion. That is a fact.
I stand corrected on the stillborn. You're absolutely right. I simply misspoke. But, Senator, do you not want any kind of prenatal testing? I mean, would we just turn our back on science, that this is something that expectant mothers should not go through, that it's best not to know about these things ahead of time?
Okay, that's the final straw. He says, you know, that's the choice, not knowing. Are you for not knowing? And then let's watch what Santorum does.
I mean, is that what you're saying here?
No, I'm not saying, look, people have the right to do it, but to have the government force people to provide it free just has, to me, is a bit loaded. There are all sorts of prenatal testing which should be provided free. I have no problem with that if the insurance companies want to. I'm not for any of these things to be forced. Let me just step back and say I don't believe any of these procedures, anything in insurance should be forced. So let me just start from there.
Okay. It's a cave. He caves. He loses the argument, right? So there we have a test in terms of a conversation, how it plays out. So let's see if I can get back. Stan, I might need your help to get back to the, let's see. Back to that. Okay. So, all right, there was your experiment on TV. Now let's look at the experiment in the polls. What happens when this plays out politically? Whose side does the audience go to, right? And here we have a poll conducted by National Journal after Santorum had his big thing over the prenatal testing, after he made that statement. And the question is asked, not just whether people should be allowed to, but should there be a mandate that insurance companies cover the prenatal testing with the abortion argument in there, okay? And the answer is by 2 to 1, 60 to 30, people side with Schieffer's side, not with Santorum's. And if you look at the question below it, which is about the birth control mandate, the prenatal testing mandate outscores it. That's a 2 to 1 at the top, and that's about so it's about a 10-point difference, a 20-point net difference. So people really like the prenatal argument. The anti-prenatal argument, prenatal testing argument, loses. Does prenatal testing cause more abortions? Yes, but for several reasons, it's not going to play out that way. First of all, you're going to reduce the fetal death from amniocentesis, which we just talked about earlier, about a 0.5 to 1% miscarriage rate. The abortions are going to be earlier, which is less morally troubling. And eventually, if we follow the testing and the science, we can get to technologies that cure instead of aborting. This is just a quick timeline. You don't have to read this, but this is a timeline of fetal development. The point of this is the time between 10 weeks and 20 weeks matters, okay? Normal people care about this. This is an abortion of the second trimester is much less approved, and here is the evidence for it. This is the Gallup poll from last year. Look at the difference between the approval of the first and second trimester abortions, okay? 62, 24, it is enormous. So a technology, if the non-invasive testing can be done early, and we've heard some dispute about what that is, right? I've heard 7 weeks. I've read hopes of 5 weeks. Today I'm hearing 10 weeks. But basically, if you could take something that was done at an amnio stage and bring it up to 10 weeks or earlier, you can start changing the political calculus about how people feel about the abortion. So you're actually more pro-life by doing the test earlier. And I think this is just about the end. This is a poll done, so in addition to the pro-life reasons, this is the pro-choice reason why the earlier testing, why the non-invasive testing has a huge advantage. Do you guys remember the fight over ultrasound in Virginia? Okay, they passed the bill, okay, but that guy on the right, the governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, who's looking pretty cocky in the picture, had to back off and request that the legislature amend the bill to remove, so it did not require transvaginal ultrasounds. Why? Because people who didn't like abortion were really creeped out by the idea that the law was going to require a probe of the woman, okay? So if you look at this poll, this is a poll done in Pennsylvania, but I used it because it compares the two. You can see that the opposition to fetal ultrasound law per se is very narrow, 48-42, but the opposition to the transvaginal ultrasound is enormous, okay? And that is telling you that if you come in with an argument about about prenatal testing, and you can, I mean, what you're saying, if you, Rick Santorum, want to stop the non-invasive test, what are you telling us? That we have to have the invasive test? And this poll data says that will be enormously unpopular if you want to insist on women having the invasive test. So last slide. If you're pro-life, what can you do about this? I think that it's really difficult for pro-lifers to do much. I think they can affect counseling. And if you look at the history of abortion legislation in this country over the last 10 years, counseling regulations have been very popular. So that they can try to influence genetic counseling. And secondly, I think they need to do kind of an escape forward. In the case of the stem cell fight, people really wanted medical science to do something about these diseases. So pro-lifers had to offer adult stem cells, and when that didn't work, they had to come up with something else, and induced pluripotent cells have become sort of a gateway to the future. So something like that will probably happen here. I don't think pro-lifers can hold us back from the playing God idea. I think people just want to be able to have a better life, and for their kids to have a better life, to have healthier children, and nothing's going to stop that. But if you're against killing, we can move forward to prenatal, to preimplantation rather than prenatal, so you don't have technically an abortion at that point, or preconception testing of gametes, or just to advance from chucking to fixing, because right now everything we've been talking about is chucking. You test, it's not viable, it's not healthy enough, we chuck it, and in the future, the science and the technology can lead us to fixing, which is better for everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm Sharon Terry from Genetic Alliance, and I'm going to give you the patient group perspective, although I must say that that's a very blurry line these days. It isn't as crisp and clear as it was, say, 10, 20 years ago. We did a quick and dirty survey over the last couple of days of patient groups, and then it was open, so I have no doubt that others, in fact, some people in this room probably answered the survey as well. But we looked at multiple choice respondents and open-ended respondents who randomly sent you to one or the other of the surveys just to see what's the level of awareness. And 2 years ago, I was part of this conference, and our community was not terribly much aware of this issue, and now it seems that they are more aware, though certainly not as apprised as some other communities, perhaps. So not aware of prenatal diagnosis in both the multiple choice and the open-ended respondents was somewhere between 36 and 47%. Aware of it, but don't know details about it, 32% in the multiple choice and 28% in the open-ended. Again, this was random. aware of it and know a lot about it, 18 and 15%, so a fairly decent number of people, and then experience with it, 9% and 4%. We looked at having people answer multiple choice questions that were clearly leading, and when we gave them the potential answers, and then we did just an open-ended one, and I'll show you both of those. So in the drawbacks, an N of 82, people felt it would be only available to women of higher socioeconomic status was the most critical issue, allowing society to screen for genetic conditions, thus eliminating fetuses from the population, came in a little over 40%, and it's too expensive, somewhere around the 40% line as well. The benefits, again, in the multiple choice group, additional testing options via blood draw to women in rural areas came in as the highest one. So again, sort of socioeconomic disparities, lower risk compared to those incurred through other similar technologies, allows women to more easily access testing and provides information about the pregnancy and information earlier in pregnancy, time to prepare and seek out specialists. Some of the drawbacks that these people wrote in the open block were the lack of access and knowledge about NIPD could reduce its usefulness, it could provide unnecessary anxiety, there will be a false sense of security, this has a long way to go and will be like 23andMe. In the meantime, I think the person meant with not a lot of uptake in the general population. I wouldn't be interested in this personally, someone wrote, even though they had a child with it, and that it'll increase abortions. And the only benefit that was written in the open blocks was, although the test may be more expensive, it's not much more expensive, and it will become less expensive. And one of the comments was, this will be used madly by society to terminate non-perfect children. Some of what we saw before. The drawbacks in the open-ended group, so this is a group that didn't have any multiple choice, so the N is much lower. What we did discover is people would rather click buttons than write stuff. So the more terminations, certainly one out, 24%, the results not being trustworthy. No drawbacks was interesting that it ranked up in 12%. And then a whole host of other things that, again, I think we've heard about all day today. Issues that I think people feel are important. And then the kind of more extreme answers, anti-abortion charities going wild when this technology is rolled out. And the technology will deprive us of a badly needed way to temper our own human immodesties, imperfections remind us. The benefits in the open-ended group, better planning to welcome an affected child, non-invasive and less risky, informed decision-making, et cetera. So a little bit more weight toward what am I going to do about planning toward an affected child than I think we would see in the general population. Fewer dead, healthy babies was an interesting way of putting that this less invasive screening might result in less difficulties. In 2010, this is a slide that I put up, and I don't think that we've changed all that much in the community. This is from Victoria Miller, who founded the Trisomy 18 Foundation, whose child died when it was a couple hours old. At that point, she said there's a lot of opinions, and they're varied, as you might surmise. This is very true in our community. Again, the community is very amorphous boundaries these days, but for those in the community, when these conversations occur, for example, in conditions like spinal muscular atrophy, there is a group of people who very much want to see carrier screening, prenatal screening, all kinds of diagnoses, et cetera, so that people could make the decision to terminate. Those are often people who have suffered the death of their child and understand that that has given the family enormous stress, divorce, financial issues, et cetera. There's a whole camp of individuals with children with SMA or Down syndrome or spina bifida, other diseases, that have felt that the ability to terminate these children earlier has decreased the number of children, decreased the attention to the disease, and decreased the amount of federal funding for research on the disease. And so the tension in the community is often really interesting when these groups of people are quite fearless about making these claims and having this argument with one another. She said at that time differences largely derive from perceptions and understanding about how fatal the condition is, and I think that is true. And again, with a lot of conditions, you get a kind of spectrum of penetrance and all sorts of things that make it difficult to say one thing or another in black and white. And then the moral and political positions relative to the pro-life, pro-choice. So I think in the disease community, what's different about this test compared to this kind of testing compared to a lot of other testing is the service delivery has some people troubled, that it has some direct-to-consumer implications. Although what I find this year from 2 years ago, this is much less troubling to people. I think they've begun to see that we're going to see some integration of genetic testing in a kind of direct-to-consumer format, and that if we have the right services around that model, that it will be okay. Technology issues around whether or not the technology is accurate, all the things we've been hearing today, certainly the more savvy in our community are asking the same questions. What's the emerging meaning? And by that I mean I think we're going to see, again, if we go to a way to do more and more tests, more and more conditions, then the meaning of the test changes and the meaning of the ability to ferret out this information. And of course, the ethical, legal, and social issues that we saw earlier. So some of the questions I think that are being asked in our community is will the whole child be out of range? What's the range if we start to determine what's normal and abnormal? Social sensibilities about the milder syndromes, who's advocating for these challenged citizens. I don't want this to happen in my backyard. I don't want to be responsible for this kind of testing or even promulgating it, but I also don't want to be paying for these kinds of things. We've seen some really vicious discussions on blogs about people saying, really, you should not be having that child, and you should not be making us as fellow citizens pay for all the care and all the educational structures, et cetera, around the child. Concerns around trivializing termination. Who are we when it's very easy for us to make those decisions? Will they be easier if they're made earlier? Will they be easier if we start to move some of the more milder conditions into the more serious ones? A sense from some of the community that no damaged goods will be permitted. And again, these are mothers and fathers of kids who in many, many ways have disabilities that are rather severe. And lots of them deal every day with having to live with all of those severe disabilities. And they feel like people look at their child and think the child is damaged and not normal. So they fear that this will give an even greater or an easier bar, in fact, to get over for that. Striving for the right fetus is every fetus on trial. So what Genetic Alliance has done over the last couple of years is say, so what are we going to do? And I think the biggest thing that we offer is to be able to bring the perspectives of consumers into these conversations. And certainly we've seen a lot of other kinds of consumer engagement throughout the day. I think a lot of those come, though, from either professional societies or academic groups or clinical groups. And we start a priori from the point of view of the consumer. And what we've done are focus group surveys. We've just finished a congenital conditions project that was very interesting. It was money that was earmarked through several of the disease advocacy groups in Down syndrome, spina bifida, and what they call dwarfism, achondroplasia, essentially because those groups became afraid that the federal government will be spending less money on their conditions as less numbers of those children are born. It is true that less numbers of those children are born, and we could include in there Friedreich's ataxia, we could include Fragile X, we could include a number of other diseases, and it's not just because of non-invasive prenatal screening. We are also looking at what our participant-centric outcomes look like. At the same time as we bend the cost curve, what are we doing in order to understand how do we get better patient outcomes? And then we're building some interactive engagement tools. We run the nation's newborn screening clearinghouse and Baby's First Test, and we're looking at that issue there. And Genes in Life is an interactive engagement tool because this is not the only place consumers are meeting genetics, and we'll need the tools that they will have to use to go forward. Too bad, this is messed up big time. Sorry. So I just wanted to end with a personal note, and that is which was a lovely picture of my two children when they were diagnosed in 1994 with pseudoxanthoma elasticum, which is a genetic disease that will cause them to lose their vision when they're about age 30. They're age 22 and 24 right now. My daughter is the executive director of the foundation that we founded for the disease, and my son is a webmaster. And when they were 15 and 13, they sort of sat us down and said, you're trying to get rid of genetic diseases in the world, and you should know that we're striving to live with a genetic disease. And they went on. And they thought that we should broaden our definition of health and disease so that we could understand the meaning of life better. They were challenging the idea of the normal and what we would consider normal. And I think what we see as we move into testing like this is a real challenge to our sensibility around that as people. Both of my children today would say that everybody has the right to have prenatal diagnosis, screening and diagnosis of any kind, and should also be able to make the decisions that they want to make. They are not at all saying anything about that, but they were saying, let's be really considerate about understanding that continuum as we move forward. Thank you.
My name is Brian Skotko, and I'm currently a medical geneticist at Children's Hospital Boston. This month and next month, I'll be a medical geneticist at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I'll be taking care of the Down syndrome program there. And Hank asked me to talk about what is the Down syndrome community's specific response to the new prenatal test. And I think the reason why he asked me is, while I have no financial relationships, I do proudly volunteer with many of the Down syndrome organizations, and in that capacity has had an opportunity to serve on their boards, to get to know them, and with my colleagues provide some medical advice. And I also do have an adult sister with Down syndrome. When we say, what is the Down syndrome community's response, just like there are multiple medical testing organizations, there are multiple different Down syndrome organizations. And by just one count alone, there's about 6 national Down syndrome organizations, and certainly there is variance between many of them. But the community got together on June 17, 2009, between 2 of the national Down syndrome organizations, the National Down Syndrome Society and the National Down Syndrome Congress, with 3 of the major medical organizations to come up with a consensus statement. And I have to say, I admire those who were involved in it, because in one weekend, they agreed on a lot, which oftentimes never happens, as many of you know who work on these consensus statements. And out of this document came misperceptions that they all agreed need to be stamped out. And this is what the Down syndrome communities represented there, and the medical organizations all agreed were misperceptions. And that is, oh, those OBs are just out there to reduce the number of individuals with the genetic condition. Everyone agrees that that's wrong. That's a misperception. They don't stand for that, all 5 of them. The purpose of offering prenatal testing is simply to decrease the number of children being born with Down syndrome. The 2 national organizations there, in addition to the others, felt testing is just testing, and testing is bringing accurate information to parents. It's how you deal with that testing and the counseling that really makes a difference. 90% of pregnancies prenatally diagnosed with Down syndrome are terminated. We hear that number being thrown around. You probably saw this paper just came out, which answers all the questions for us. I came out in prenatal diagnosis, and you could see that population-based studies have only been done in 3 states. So we don't have national numbers. And in these 3 states with very small numbers, the answer is about 74.6% of women who get a definitive diagnosis of Down syndrome through amnio or CVS choose to terminate based on population-based data from small sample sizes, from dated sample sets from 3 states. That's all we have. So that's why the 90% is a misperception. NDSS and NDSC are pro-life propaganda organizations. Everyone agrees that those 2 organizations have no pro-life or pro-choice statements. They're simply pro-information organizations, just like the other medical organizations. Genetic counselors, they're out to influence. Everyone agrees that's not true. And prenatal testing are performed exclusively to detect Down syndrome. Not the case, of course. I have to say this is all kind of commonsensical to those of us in this room, but this was really a landmark consensus statement, because I think there was misperceptions among all 5 groups, and they come together to agree. We all believe that these are misperceptions. But in that same document in 2009, they said, well, we need to collectively change things. We need to, 1, develop standardized practice guidelines. How do we as doctors and clinical physicians give a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome? 2, how do we train the healthcare providers of today and tomorrow? What information do we give? Why is the booklet that we give out in Tallahassee, Florida, different from the Down syndrome booklet that's given out in Bangor, Maine? Can't we all agree there is one document? And number 4, we really need to improve public lives. Because as we know, you only get 10 minutes to describe all of the new testing. Wouldn't it be great if America was educated about Down syndrome before they became pregnant? So I wanted to give you an update on each one of these 4 items. The standardized practice guidelines, I have to say, have now been written. I was asked to join 29 of my colleagues from genetic counseling, OBGYN, maternal fetal medicine, to do an evidence-based study to go back and look at all of the reports that you have all written over the years to learn from women, how do you want to get the diagnosis of Down syndrome prenatally. It was really exceptional just to have an opportunity to work with such talented colleagues. I just want to give you the answers at the end of the book, so to speak. One, the results of prenatal screening should never be explained as a positive or a negative result by request. This is all request of women in these studies. That they get a risk factor, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 400, that's their number. This is an update how well we're doing. Still, 9% of us say positive or negative, 15% say normal or abnormal, 23% say low risk or high risk, and only about 35 of us still say we're giving the woman the number so that she could grapple with what that number means for her or her partner. 2, prior to amnio or CVS, discuss all reasons for a prenatal diagnosis. 3 and 4, the best practices are, if you're a healthcare provider and you're going through and you're signing up an expectant couple for an amnio or CVS, you say on Thursday at 3 o'clock, can I give you a call with the results? Oh, that time doesn't work? What about Thursday at 4 o'clock? Okay, that time works. So we've learned from women, pre-established times work well, and then on that phone call you say, and if I'm going to tell you the results indicate Down syndrome, I'll invite one of my expert physician colleagues to be on the phone to answer any questions that you might have. What we learned doesn't work from women is cold calls. So they're shopping and Stop and Shop, and at 2 o'clock the phone goes off, they pick up the phone, and they get the diagnosis right there, and they're stymied and they can't find the exit. So it really does seem to be a moment that's crystallized in time as a flashbulb memory. In that brief, uncompensated phone call that you have no time to make, 3 questions we learned need to be answered. What is Down syndrome? What causes the condition? Those of you who are involved in these conversations know that a vast majority of women will somehow secretly blame themselves, so dispelling that myth that there's nothing you did that caused Down syndrome. And then the tougher question, what's realistic expectations for someone living with Down syndrome today? And if there's one variable that seems to come through where women will rate us more highly as healthcare providers is whether or not we provided the phone number or a connection to a Down syndrome support group. Whether or not they make that phone call is up to them, but simply providing that lifeline seems to be very helpful. Use non-directive language, and of course offer up-to-date information. The National Society of Genetic Counselors also came out with guidelines on how to deliver a diagnosis. List this here for the purpose of the talk. I don't have time to go through all of them, but they're very complementary to the ones that I've already discussed. I want to give you an update on number 2, training healthcare providers. It's a very difficult process, a challenging process if you've been in that position of giving a diagnosis as much as it is receiving it. But people and we are not alone. So Brighter Tomorrows was an NIH-funded study which created an online simulation of patients getting a diagnosis or prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome. And the website is now available for everyone for free. And if you go there, the medical student, the genetic counseling student, the well-practiced OBGYN could go there and you press play. And then the couple says, I want that new test. And then all of a sudden pauses, says, what would you say? Then you play again. Then they're crying, you gave them the test, and then you get sweaty palms, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. So it's a way of practicing it online that's been validated and tested by OBGYN residents and pediatric residents, and now available for free. Previous President Bush signed into law the Prenatally and Postnatally Diagnosed Condition Awareness Act, which is a law that will make monies available for anyone through competitive grant processes who would like to improve how physicians deliver a diagnosis. And so far, monies have been given out through that competitive process. An update on number 3, that booklet, what should be given out. There's lots of different booklets out there, but a process was started as funded by the Kennedy Foundation. Eunice Kennedy Shriver wanted to fund a project where she brought together all key stakeholders. I was one of them. 2.5 years ago to look at all the information that was out there and to identify the best balanced source of information, knowing it's really tough for a lot of smart people to agree this is the information that should be given out to all prenatal couples. And then they engaged the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the American College of Medical Geneticists, and the National Society of Genetic Counselors also to be involved in their process, knowing that the feedback and the input from both the Down syndrome community and the medical community was important. To date, there are many different books that are out there, but there's only one that has been reviewed by all those medical organizations, and it is this one, Understanding a Down Syndrome Diagnosis, and you can learn more about that through lettercase.org. But this, of course, is printed on the back of the book, which I think makes it so powerful for many of my medical colleagues, knowing that the book was really looked through with a fine-tooth comb. Every comma, every period, every photo was reviewed. So much so, even the photos had thought put into it. No child with Down syndrome will be looking at you in the eye as a reviewer in order to make you feel guilty. So even the children with Down syndrome are staring off screen so as to make the information inviting for the expectant parent. For those women who want to continue a diagnosis after they get a prenatal diagnosis, this website was created, downsyndromepregnancy.org, which is a free booklet available online for all of those really important questions. I know I'm going to continue this pregnancy, but what am I going to tell my mother-in-law? When do I tell my mother-in-law? What do I put on my birth announcements? When do I send out my birth announcements? What should I tell my grandparents? And so this is a website that makes that communication possible. It's available for free. Then my colleagues and I wanted to know, well, what do families really feel it's like to raise someone with Down syndrome? We're talking about tests, we're talking about the condition, but we haven't polled them yet. As many of you know, there's no national population-based registry for individuals with Down syndrome, so we did the next best thing we could think of, and we polled families, and we try to get geographic and demographic and socio-demographic background. And so 2,000 parents and guardians we surveyed, and you could see 99% loved their son or daughter with Down syndrome, very positive feelings, although 5% and 4% do have a feeling of being embarrassed or having some regret. We polled the brothers and sisters as well, as oftentimes I get that question, and I'm sure you do too. What impact will this have on my other children? You could see that lots of brothers and sisters are very proud of their sibling, love their sibling, and feel they're better people. And 7% and 4% feel embarrassed in some capacity. And for the first time, we polled people with Down syndrome to ask what their lives are like. And you could see that overwhelmingly they're happy about their lives, they love their family, they like how they look, and only 4% express some sadness about their lives. I often wonder if we polled ourselves, what would our numbers look like in this group? But there it is. Unless you ask, this is a survey just to show we had all different capabilities of individuals with Down syndrome, the high functioning and the low functioning, and we looked at to see whether or not that would impact people's scores, and it did not. So we got the same results whether or not someone was, quote, low functioning or high functioning with Down syndrome. Public information, the National Down Syndrome Society has created PSAs with some celebrities in order to talk about Down syndrome. They have an ad campaign that you'll see in like Vogue magazine and In-Flight magazines, which will take you to a website where you can learn more about people with Down syndrome. The National Down Syndrome Congress also has an ad campaign that they're rolling out as well for the whole point of educating pre-pregnant America about Down syndrome. There's only one organization that has come up with a report card or a criteria about the new non-invasive prenatal testing, and that's the National Down Syndrome Society. And you can find this on their webpage. They came up with criteria that they feel are important for medical testing companies in order to follow. And they have come up with a grading system that's publicly posted on their website with the promise that they will do this for each genetic company that comes out. All of these criteria have been communicated to the companies, and so they're well aware of what the Down syndrome community, at least through the NDSS, believes. So the first criteria, and this is the report card for Sequenom that I just pulled from the website, is that good testing should be done. The second criteria is that it needs to be clearly marked what forms of Down syndrome are being tested for. The next criteria is that the decision on whether or not to have it done should be the decision of the pregnant woman or her significant other as desired and appropriate. It should be a voluntary test. And again, this is all scored by the board of the National Down Syndrome Society for Sequenom. All pregnant women should be fully informed as to the purpose, limitations, and expense of NIPD. That's what we've been talking about, the counseling session. And each pregnant woman opting to proceed with NIPD should sign an informed consent, which should include at minimum this understanding. The company performing the test should not accept nor process any samples without first receiving a signed informed consent. And no companies, from my understanding, has made that promise that they won't process samples without knowing informed consent has passed. The first one is if the results are not 100% accurate, women should be told that. The next one is that the National Down Syndrome Society feels that when an expectant couple gets a positive result through their ordering provider, has gotten those results by the testing company, that they should also be provided with up-to-date, accurate information, a booklet that really is balanced. And the National Down Syndrome Society feels that it's the company's responsibility to send within 24 hours of sending the result of the test to the ordering provider, also to send up-to-date information about Down syndrome, a booklet, to the ordering provider, so that ordering provider could decide whether or not that information is helpful or appropriate to hand on and pass forward to the patient receiving that result. The marketing materials, the testing companies should make clear that all women have an absolute right to continue a pregnancy. There are certainly all sorts of different options and reasons why people choose. And then the company should demonstrate some commitment to educating the medical community who's going to need to handle this. And the National Down Syndrome Society feels that all these criteria need to be passed in order to get an overall passing grade. So many people I need to thank for the research that I particularly did. You can see where my funding sources came from my hospitals. And of course, I couldn't do it without the work of many local Down syndrome organizations that I volunteer for. And that is how we could stay in touch. Thank you again for having me.
Hi, I'm Jaime King. I'm an associate professor at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. And I want to thank Hank for inviting me to speak to you all today, and for all of you for sticking around in the afternoon to hear me do so. So what I'm going to talk about is shift gears just a little bit and position NIPT in the midst of the debate that we are currently having about abortion in this country. We've started to talk about how it is going to play into abortion and how it looks at it, but I want to delve a little more deeply into what's going on with respect to abortion legislation in this country. I think that NIPT really has the potential to change the way we practice prenatal care, the way we think about reproduction, and in a lot of respects, it has the potential to change the scope of reproductive autonomy. Without question, it's going to give women, it has the potential to give women more information at an earlier point in the pregnancy. And this has the ability to expand their reproductive autonomy. But this ability is going to come at the same time that we are seeing more and more interest in states of contracting access to abortion and limiting reproductive autonomy in certain ways. And so the collision of this technology with a very directed political agenda is important for us to talk about and important for us to consider as this technology moves forward. And so what I want to do is sort of fit the technology into that overarching debate. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about 3 instances of reproductive rights legislation that's relevant to NIPT. The first is fetal pain legislation. The second is what I call reasons-based abortion prohibitions, where abortion is prohibited when it's sought for a particular reason. And the third is reasons-based testing prohibitions, where access to a specific kind of genetic test would be prohibited in a certain state. And the third category does not exist yet, but it's been brought up in different forms of literature as a potential. So let's start with Pain-Capable Unborn Child Acts. In 2010, Nebraska passed the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, and when it did so, it was the first state to challenge the viability standards set forth in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And that case held that states could not put an undue burden on the right of a woman to make a decision to have an abortion prior to viability. But based on findings that unborn fetuses felt pain as early as 22 weeks after the last menstrual period. They say 20 weeks, it's 20 weeks post-conception, but I'm going to put everything in terms of last menstrual period timing just so that we keep it consistent. But so based on that, Nebraska prohibited all abortions except for those to save the life of the mother, post 22 weeks LMP. And this is a significant move forward from what we like to think where viability had been at 24 weeks to 26 weeks, depending on the state that you're in. No challenge has been brought to these laws, even though they directly conflict with viability. And I think largely this is because pro-choice groups don't want to bring a challenge in front of this Supreme Court. They don't want an abortion legislation to go up, potentially for fear of the results. But Nebraska isn't the only state that has done this. Earlier this month, Georgia became the 9th state to pass fetal pain legislation, prohibiting abortions beyond 22 weeks. Arizona has gone one step further, which prohibits abortions with the exception of saving the life of the mother beyond 20 weeks, which is 18 weeks post-conception. Bills have been introduced in 10 other states that are awaiting votes. 2 weeks ago, Congress introduced the act that would prohibit the DC pain-capable unborn child abortion act that would make it illegal to have an abortion in the District of Columbia beyond 22 weeks. And so this kind of legislation is getting significant traction across the country. Furthermore, Mitt Romney has held that he will support this kind of legislation on the national level if he is elected president. So what's the connection to NIPT here? Well, obviously it's timing, right? As we've seen multiple times today, the prenatal screening timeline pushes finding out if you're high risk for many, many women until the 2nd trimester. If you don't find out that you're high risk until the 2nd trimester, you're not actually going to go through genetic counseling until somewhere about 17 weeks, maybe at the earliest. Then you've got to decide if you want to have an amniocentesis, schedule that amniocentesis, wait and get the results back, and then decide whether or not you're going to terminate the pregnancy. If that's at 24 to 26 weeks, you're pushing that timeline already. For fetal pain states, you're going to move significantly forward up to this 20 to 22 weeks, which is going to make it extremely difficult for women under the current framework to be able to get that information in time to make a thoughtful, reasoned termination decision. Ironically, in some instances, if you don't have, given how short that timing is, women may be more encouraged to abort if they got negative news because they won't have the opportunity to find out what life with an affected child is like, to pursue all the resources that might be available to them to have that child. So NIPT offers a really significant benefit for women in enabling them to find out this information much earlier, in time to either very quickly schedule a CVS or to have an amniocentesis as early as possible at about 15 weeks. Then you've got significantly more time to make a thoughtful and reasoned decision. And so in that respect, it's going to help protect and expand women's reproductive autonomy as fetal pain laws continue to expand. So this brings me to my second type of legislation that's being passed. There's also a growing trend in state legislatures to prohibit abortion providers from performing abortions sought for specific reasons. And I call these, for absolutely lack of a better name, reasons-based abortion prohibitions. If you have a better way of calling this, please let me know. I'd be thrilled to know what it is. This raises significant constitutional questions, right? If a woman has a fundamental right to abort because she does not want a child at all, does that right necessarily entail the ability to abort for any specific reason? Many people would say instinctively, well, yes, of course. If you can abort for no reason, then you can abort for any reason. But as we've seen earlier today, others would suggest that while abortion might be appropriate because a woman just doesn't want a child, it may not be appropriate for each and every genetic condition, right? Things like sex selection, milder medical conditions, behavioral characteristics, and things like the like. As Will put up in his slides, there was a recent poll done earlier this month which held that 77% of Americans believe that bans on sex selection should be upheld and would support a ban on sex selection. And as we know, there's a large percentage of Americans that would say that abortion is not appropriate in any context, right, for any reason. And in the last 3 years, what we have seen is federal and state governments taking up this issue. We've seen the federal government and 8 state legislatures have reasons-based abortion prohibitions brought before them. Most of these have occurred under the guise of sex selection prohibitions. So we have 4 states that have passed prohibitions on sex-selective abortions. There are also bills that exist in 6 other states. Oklahoma has gone one step beyond and requires every abortion provider to provide every patient with a 10-page questionnaire regarding their reasons for having an abortion, and this questionnaire must be submitted and reported as the provider reports every abortion that they provide. But it's not just stuck with sex selection, it's also been, Arizona extended this to race selection prohibitions. So in Arizona, it is a Class 3 felony to provide an abortion that a provider knows is being sought solely on the basis of sex or of the race of the fetus or of the race of the parent. Now, this does not include sex selection of abortions for medical reasons, it's only for non-medical reasons. But that is also in the legislature. At the federal level, in 2010, Congress put forward the Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act, which would also prohibit race and sex-based abortions. This was unsuccessful in 2010, but the bill was reintroduced in December of 2011. It has 96 Republican sponsors and 3 Democratic sponsors, and it is gaining a significant amount of interest across the board. It includes federal criminal penalties for anyone who performs, coerces, solicits funds to pay for, or transports a woman across state lines for the purpose of having a sex or race-based abortion. It also provides for private civil enforcement penalties so that an individual who was affected by the abortion could sue the provider, in addition to receiving criminal penalties. There is no enforcement of any of these provisions. None of these laws that I have seen would encroach upon the woman at all. They would not put penalties on any woman who sought this. Okay. We're unlikely to stop at the point of race and sex-based abortions. I think it's important to recognize that, to put them in the context of a slow and deliberate political strategy that is being carried out. So the Americans United for Life is a major pro-life organization, has made reasons-based abortion prohibitions a significant focus of their legislative strategy in 2011. They produced model legislation and a policy guide that would help instruct states on how to ban abortions both on sex selection, but also for genetic abnormalities across the board. And this model legislation was recently adopted into a bill that has been put forth in the Missouri legislature. Hearings, the Abortion Ban for Sex Selection and Genetic Abnormalities Act of 2012. Genetic abnormalities has been defined very, very broadly as part of that bill. And hearings just went on, open hearings just went on this bill in May of this month, in May 2nd. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of these laws. Although they're gaining momentum in the political sector, they are subject to considerable constitutional and practical challenges. Constitutionally, the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause still does protect our right to have, women's right to have an abortion and to make the decision to have an abortion. And it seems that these state laws would directly interfere with this. It seems as though they would place an undue burden on a woman's ability to decide to have an abortion for whatever reason. If they tell you once you have decided to have one, you cannot because of the reason that you have chosen. And so in some ways, it seems under existing precedent that this would be something that could be overturned. But no challenge has been brought yet, and it does remain quite uncertain as to what the Supreme Court would do if a challenge like this actually came up in front of it. It may depend on the condition that is being tested for in general. By some arguments, the more severe the condition, the more likely the court would be to hold that it is within a woman's reproductive right to make a decision about whether or not to terminate under those conditions. But line drawing is going to be really difficult. How do you decide those genetic conditions which are appropriate to abort for from those that are not? And so the court may favor an all or nothing outcome to have to avoid that kind of consistent line drawing. But I want to raise a more a more subtle question and a more subtle point here. As these laws keep getting passed, and as states continue, and they keep getting not challenged, we see states pushing further and further on what they're going to do. So as we move into, from sex selection to sex and race-based selection to genetic abnormalities, what they're trying to do is one of two things, right? Constrain the reasons for which abortion is available, or draw that constitutional challenge. So either way, it's a win-win for them, right? The laws either stand, or they get the challenge to the Supreme Court that they're looking for. And so it's very hard to figure how to position oneself against these laws, except to not let them pass and to fight them from the outset. Practically, they're pretty ineffective, right? They're going to be, a woman simply just does not have to tell her provider why she's seeking the abortion, right? In fact, some providers might make that disclaimer as women walk through the door. It would be better if you just, if you're having an abortion for these reasons, I should remind you that it's illegal to, to do so, for me to provide that to you if I know that. So in a lot of respects, they're not very effective if a woman is very determined to have an abortion, but they may deter prenatal testing for certain conditions, and they may just deter women at the outset from seeking it if they know that it's overall illegal. So if these laws are held to be unconstitutional or unenforceable to the likings of a specific state, this may raise interest in a third type of legislation. These laws are reasons-based testing prohibitions, and these would be the instance where a state would ban the availability of genetic tests for certain conditions pre-viability, so that that information couldn't be used in making a termination decision. I don't know if these are likely to come up. I don't know if they, how and for what conditions. I would imagine they would be mostly for non-medical conditions and things like that. But they're going to be more tenable for states. They're less likely to raise the constitutional challenge because it's an easier argument to make that, well, you're not prohibiting the abortion, right? You're prohibiting the information on which to make the abortion decision, and that hasn't been as traditionally protected. You may run into First Amendment problems later, but that's a whole different issue. And I think the really important thing that we want to see happen here is to think about what's the best way to analyze this. What's the best way to think about NIPT and all of the different things that it offers? I think a stronger argument can be made against, in favor of keeping testing on the table, but you have to take it out of the abortion context. And I think this is the thing that will be important for everyone to do, is to recognize that we shouldn't be thinking about reasons-based testing prohibitions or attempts to ban testing in terms of just a woman's procreative liberty. There is so much more that goes into them than that, right? They will inform women's decisions. They will enable them to make choices about how to raise their children, how to make decisions about what they're going to do with their body during pregnancy, what treatments they might take, what nutritional supplements they might take, how to make decisions about their personal life and as well as their parenting thing. And so as a result, women's ability to protect their right to have these tests are going to come not only from the value of this testing information to the abortion decision, but also from their own ability to make decisions based on this information and the liberty that they have in their parenting liberty and personal liberty, which are also 14th Amendment protected rights. So, let's skip over that. What are the implications of this for NIPT? I think that as this legislation is aimed at restricting abortion across the board, I think it has significant implications, both good and bad, for the integration of NIPT into prenatal care. I think we're going to have to think about how we integrate this technology, how we talk about it, and how we frame it and market it. In doing so, with an eye towards what's happening on a national scale with respect to reproductive rights. The factors that I think are going to be important for manufacturers, for providers, for patients, are things along the line of what traits and conditions are we offering this testing for? Is it severe medical conditions? Is it things, or is it traits and other kinds of conditions? Is it milder conditions? The more we push into that agenda, the less it looks like something that's essential as part of a reproductive right, and it may be subject to regulation? How are we marketing this technology? Are we marketing it as something that allows, that pushes towards termination? And what's the method of transmission? Is it something that's being offered direct to consumer, or is it something that's being offered directly to the, directly by the physician? I think the more it looks like a medical condition, the more states might tend to stay out of it. But I'm not so sure. I think I'm out of time, so I will leave it at that. But I welcome your questions and thoughts. Thank you very much for your attention.
So many ethical, legal, and social issues implicated by this technology that I figured we need a panel of 100 in order to have somebody on the panel interested in all of them. But since we happen to have a panel of 100 people in this room, I want you to be part of the panel. Before we get to questions from the audience, though, I'm curious whether the panelists have anything to say to each other. And particularly, I want to throw a hand grenade into this. Will, you were commenting on federal, national, overall trends. Jaime was focusing more on state-by-state issues. Jaime, Will, are you two inconsistent with each other, consistent with each other, or something else?
Well, I was thinking about that. As I was listening to you talk, I was wondering to what extent. I think we're actually pretty consistent with each other. I just think that there may be laws that are passed on a state-by-state basis that may not be as subject as much to some of the
I will
arguments.
ask everyone, these microphones turn out on the table not to be very sensitive, so
Okay.
get them right up against your front teeth, and people in the audience will be grateful.
But I'm not sure. You know, I think that in large respect, as far as the testing goes, I think you're right. I think lots of people who oppose abortion for certain things would still very strongly advocate for the testing. I'm not sure that there aren't states that could pass a testing ban.
I don't think that we're inconsistent, but my take on on Jaime's presentation was, I see this as, there's different audiences, and I see a bunch of pro-life legislators. There are true believers in the legislatures who pass these bills because they're crusaders and they feel good about them, and they don't worry if they ever get through the courts, which they don't. And then there are these governors who are just like, you know, look, I'm worried about unemployment. I'm not worried about that. But they'll sign something and not worry about it, or they'll think about the. But in my thing, I'm totally focused on what's actually going to get a majority support, be enforced, that the public will tolerate. Stuff that there's a lot of this stuff that gets. As Jaime said, there's no way to enforce this. There's no way to. You can't have an abortion if you tell me that the reason is X. Well, of course. No one's ever going to tell you that. So, so these are feel-good laws for pro-lifers. Either they don't make it through the courts or they're not enforced. That's my impression of most of them.
I think that's right, but I think that there may be a point where, I'll be really interested to see what happens in Missouri and if other states take it up. Like, if they actually passed a law saying you could not have an abortion based on any genetic reason, don't you think there would be an uprising from, do you think people would go out and fight against it and bring a challenge against it?
Yeah, when the history of abortion politics is whenever the pro-lifers accidentally get serious or the court upholds something of theirs, they get tremendous blowback. And they had 2 years of blowback in 1989 and 1990 after the Webster decision. If Casey had gone the other way, it would have been the same thing. And they just keep there are these cycles, and then we're getting back to another one where they're going to accidentally succeed, and things are going to blow up on them again.
So Sharon, is that potential Missouri law something Genetic Alliance would be concerned about?
Yeah, so essentially what we do is take a kind of moderate stance, because to Will's point about whoever's in charge of funding should be paying more attention to funding. So GPPC has no more funding and is essentially morphed into something very academic.
Genetics and Public Policy Center.
Public Policy Center that he quoted from 2004. Genetic Alliance just lost all of our federal funding from HRSA and CDC. $4 million on Thursday will be gone. So the feds are moving toward less and less funding for consumer or public opinion kinds of things. That said, what we do then is be very conservative or moderate around what we do jump into. And so we watch something like this to see, is it real? If it's contested, is it going to hold up? If it's already not going to hold up, then we don't bother getting verbal about it. We do, however, try to make sure that all of those web tools, et cetera, that I showed give some information so individuals in those states could start to look at that. We know very well from helping to pass GINA that state by state matters a lot. and the opinions of the legislators matter a lot, but that there's a lot of grandstanding in between that we don't pay attention to.
So I'm going to move off topic after commenting on the unenforceability issue. So, you know, for military physicians, and I was one practicing under a federal gag rule against talking about terminating pregnancies during Democratic administration, the gag rule being lifted, and then back in with a gag rule in place. I was only ever aware of one military physician that ever obeyed the gag rule. So, you know, people of good conscience and people that take their Hippocratic oath seriously, you know, are able to kind of make their way around this. So off topic, and I'm sure we'll get back onto this topic, specifically for Brian, I was very interested in the NDSS report card on the NIPD providers, and specifically kind of placing laboratories in the police person's role, e.g., getting a failing grade for not providing a letter case document, you know, to a physician to provide to their patient, and even kind of stepping into the role that exists between a patient or a genetic counselor and their client or patient. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that issue.
So again, I can't speak on behalf of any of the organizations, but my best understanding is that the National Down Syndrome Society does not want to have and get in between the companies providing information directly to the expectant parents, because it is a communication between the ordering provider and the companies. And so since the ordering provider is ordering the test and getting the results back from the company, in addition to those results, the National Down Syndrome Society feels that there is an obligation for those companies to also follow up that with accurate, up-to-date, balanced information. All of that will go to the ordering provider, so it's still up to that ordering provider to decide whether or not that information he or she considers appropriate to pass along to the patient. So the National Down Syndrome Society is still respecting that doctor and patient relationship. They just want to make sure that physicians have that information, and they feel that the cost burden should be handled by the ordering, by the companies who are making the money off these tests.
And I think one of the effects of that is that it kind of, you know, along the lines of the education talk that we were having, you know, takes the responsibility out of the hands of the physician, ordering physician, and puts it into somebody else's hands.
Yep. Point. And I think that the National Down Syndrome organizations all feel strongly about educating providers on how to deliver a diagnosis, and that's where the studies came about to how do you go about delivering the diagnosis, how do you do that? But at least having some information get to the busy providers who don't have time to search for it is at least one small minimum thing that they'll get in the concept of how they want to practice medicine.
The other interesting thing in that will be looking at the chain of custody of that information. So I set up a test for pseudoxanthoma elasticum, this disease my kids have, in one lab and provide all the information. They don't always have enough information in that lab to send it back to the providing physician because it comes from LabCorp or Quest to them as an esoteric testing lab. So it will depend on what is the relationship and whether it's direct with the company or through a LabCorp or Quest or a reference lab kind of.
Hi, my name is Miriam Cooperman. I'm at UCSF, and I want to thank all of you guys for a great session. This was really fantastic. So my questions are directed to you, Brian, and I've followed your work for a while. I have my own career is based in looking at women's decision-making about prenatal testing. And I will disclose that I, too, am a member of the Down syndrome society, or what's the word, community, if you could call it one thing. And I have a 45-year-old sister with Down syndrome. I love her very much. We're still very close. And I also, from my work, as is clear, am a very strong advocate of informed decision-making at the get-go before anyone starts on the course of prenatal testing. And with all of that as an introduction, I have to say that I find very upsetting what is presented in terms of what Down syndrome is to the community at large that really doesn't have any idea. And you showed the shots from the booklet that was out there that I saw a copy of that. And honestly, I was horrified because I feel that someone reading that would have no idea of the complications associated with Down syndrome, and that's through the life cycle. And as I say, I love my sister, and my entire life, or since she was born, if I could have had one wish granted, it would have been for her to not have been born with that extra chromosome, which makes me surprised about that only 4% regret. So I guess what I'd like to say is I think it's great that you guys are doing all that work, but to really plead for more balance in the information that's provided. So thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's nice to meet you. I've admired your work as well. We'll have to talk afterwards. Well, you have an opportunity to feed that back. The creator of the booklet, Stephanie Meredith, is right there. And I know that she purposely reached out to all the medical organizations to get feedback to try to make it a booklet. And I'm sure Stephanie would say it's much of an art form as it is a science. And they do try to get it right, and I'm sure she'd value your feedback.
The other thing I think that you present is a lot of times, even us advocacy groups reach out to medical societies. We should be reaching out to the people who live with these conditions.
Yeah, and can I say that because, and also my understanding on the medical societies that ACOG did have some concerns, similar concerns, but yeah, absolutely. So this is my professional area, but again, the experience, and I know a lot of individuals with Down syndrome through my experience, and also I want to really encourage you to get, to talk to parents and siblings, not of just children with Down syndrome, because a child with Down syndrome is a completely different story than a 45-year-old with Down syndrome.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think all the organizations agree with you. When they were going through the process, they had representation from all the key stakeholders, but as you know, table is only so large and people only represent so many different backgrounds. But they were hoping through by having 2 of the national Down syndrome organizations, it really would be the responsibility of those national Down syndrome organizations to represent all constituents. But certainly, I'm not here to represent those, but sharing that feedback with the national Down syndrome organizations, if you feel they didn't capture certain perspectives of certain populations, is an important perspective for them to hear.
Thank you.
Hi. My name is Linda Whipperman-Bendor, and I'm a genetic counselor by training. And thank you all very much. It was very interesting. My comment is also mostly about what you said, Brian, and I want to support the importance of countering some of the old stereotypes about Down syndrome, which were very one-sided. There were a lot of pictures out there in people's minds of limitations that partly were, to some degree, more true in the past, partly because of the way that Down syndrome individuals were treated in the community and because of advances that had not yet been made in education and in just societal attitudes towards disabilities in general. That said, I think that part of the difficulty with Down syndrome, and I'm sure there are other genetic disorders for which this is also true, is that there is such a range, even aside from the point that the previous speaker made. Even if you look at childhood, there is such a range of severity, and part of our difficulty is there, at this time, is no way of distinguishing between a milder case of Down syndrome and a more severe case of Down syndrome, and they really can be quite different situations for a family. And it is a dilemma how to work against the old stereotypes and yet not whitewash the fact that there are, there can be significant medical and developmental and behavioral problems that a family can face that can create a lot of difficulties for the child, for the family. And I guess, so I partly have a question, having said that, but, and I guess that question is, from your experience with Down syndrome organizations, do you have the sense that those organizations are able to be representative of the Down syndrome community? In other words, do people in terms across the socioeconomic spectrum, in terms of people who may be in less supported environments where they aren't any longer two-parent households, how easily do you think those people are able to participate and be represented, therefore, in those organizations?
I really appreciate your thought, and it's a question that I've thought about a lot, and I know all the national organizations who take care of individuals with Down syndrome think about a lot. And the frustration is that there's no national registry, no population-based registry for the most common chromosomal condition. So we have no way of knowing what does the demographics look like for all the families who have individuals with Down syndrome. So when those of us who want to do studies say, well, are our studies even representative of the Americans who have a family member with Down syndrome? We have no baseline data. So I think one is many of the Down syndrome national organizations have legislation currently in Congress trying to ask the CDC and the NIH to create one of those registries so we can better understand what the demographic is, because until we have a baseline, we don't know who we're supposed to represent. With that said, while we're waiting for that to happen, I know that the national organizations do try to be something for everyone, but it takes time, it takes effort, it takes money to make sure you have campaigns to reach out. So is it a perfect representation? I doubt it, but I know that they do try to get there.
I would just add to that that in the 1,200 disease groups under our umbrella, what we find is that they're largely white and middle class and upper middle class, and that they're not representative, and that's a very difficult issue. They're also aging, so most of these organizations, what you find are 40 to 50-year-old members with their children, and now their children are adults. The younger generations are not gravitating toward these organizations, and in fact, I predict we're going to see a huge shift in advocacy overall because they're instead becoming multi-affinity associated through Facebook, through other things, and decide that certainly Down syndrome is important, but these other things are as well, and I want to be affiliated with a lot of them. The other thing I think we're seeing is that the issues around the digital divide are huge, and trying to figure out how do we reach, sure, whoever said a brochure doesn't cut it, that's absolutely true. And sometimes a website doesn't cut it, because that's not a way that certain groups of people interact. And some of the work we've been doing is in texting, because text-based phones, dumb phones, are much more popular than smartphones. So I think what we're seeing is we know we're not representing the right groups or making the right commendations. The other issue I think that's huge in the advocacy community is that there is a period through which an advocacy group is very passionate about the issue and then becomes more passionate about the disease group itself, the organization, and is almost as difficult to work with as a bigger institution and becomes focused on the survival of the institution rather than on the mission. And so what we're finding is that that gets in the way of the true mission, and that those groups, in fact, are looking at politics a lot and their survival rather than the individuals, so that we see splinter groups come, we see parents, for example, fighting against the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation because they're so focused on research and not on daily care, and the issues of these groups are not met. I think what we have to understand is this is a hugely diverse matrix of many dimensions, and certainly the penetrance or the mildness to strength of the disease, as well as how individuals live with disease, is really, really variable. Some people are fine with it, and other people, it destroys them. So to put all this into context is a huge task, and there's not going to be one size fits all.
I think this is an interesting example of the importance of contingency and chance in history. I mean, if Down syndrome didn't exist and NIPT were being introduced for trisomies 13 and 18, the discussions would be very, very different. I understand why the US companies are interested in launching with Down syndrome and building on state actions and so on, but that chance that it happens to launch with Downs for reasons we understand puts it in a different level of controversy than if it were a much more serious disease. Or on the other hand, if, as was done in some of the European countries, it was launched with Rh factor, which is not a serious, well, which is something that can be dealt with in a variety of ways and doesn't have nearly the same kinds of implications as either Downs or trisomies 13 or 18. So history is made of major forces and sometimes also of accidents.
I could just add one more thing, which is I happen to know 2 Down syndrome families pretty well. One has an adult with Down syndrome who's out in the community functioning quite well. When I spoke to that mother at some point and asked, what did you do when you were pregnant with your second child? She said, oh, I had an amniocentesis because I knew how well my child was doing on the spectrum. And both families love their kids. The other family has a child with a very severe, much more severe developmental delay and compounded by a psychiatric disorder. And that mother loves that child too. very much, and probably would have additionally probably would have taken the same action as she did, which was not to have prenatal diagnosis, but very, very different stories. And so, yeah.
I think what's made self-evident from this conference is that being pregnant is a very complex part of anyone's life, full of complex decision-makings that are informed by everyone's background. So I appreciate those two scenarios, but it speaks to the importance of, I think, really good evidence-based medicine to make sure that we get all the numbers incorporated so we know how representative, for example, those two stories would be of all pregnant women out there and their partners.
Hi, my name's Christy. I'm a genetic counselor here in the area, and one of the things that I came to the conference looking for was some information about how to incorporate this new kind of testing in a population screening sort of scenario where you're offering it to every pregnant woman like we are with the state program. And some of the issues that I have with that is that this seems to be a slightly different push from testing perspective, in that the companies who are getting the money performing the tests are doing some marketing and different things like that to get the testing out there before it's kind of vetted as a population screen. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on educating the general public on receiving this information about their fetus at a time in pregnancy where there is no other information about the fetus available. You know, ultrasound at this time is not very good at diagnosing heart defects or other complications that go along with Down syndrome. There's a lot of complicated issues that go on with terminating or continuing a pregnancy based solely on genetic information, and how to let the public know kind of what they're getting with this earlier information, what the pitfalls are, especially when there's a lot of money that can go into marketing. When I saw the title of the slide from, I think it was Natura, it was helping families have healthy children. And for this test, I'm not sure that that is an accurate way to sell it, because the only way to have a healthy child after this test is to terminate an affected child. And as many people have been talking about, there's a wide range of things that can go on. So I think specifically for Sharon and for Brian, who are in the disability community, but also seem to be wanting this test to be available in the right hands, I think. What are some of your thoughts about marketing, educating, to make this test as appropriate for public consumption as possible?
So we spend a great deal of time working on this, particularly through our maternal and child health activities. We've done some focus groups to ask exactly that question in several areas of the country, and the answers are different in different places. Again, we're going to find that context is really important, and that again, you can't make just one thing or one tool. I would say we do have examples of this in other areas. So while it seems like this is the first time we're seeing genetic testing companies market directly, that's happened before. So Oncotype DX by Genomic Health marketed directly to women with breast cancer, BRCA1 and 2 testing by Myriad to women with breast cancer, several other tests, hemochromatosis testing to the Irish American community. So it isn't so much that I think it's being marketed directly to the consumer. I think there's another sensitivity, and as Brian said, that we're learning that pregnancy is a really difficult time, because we even know from just simple newborn screening, which, you know, give us a break, it's mandated in all 50 states, it's really complicated to educate about it. There's all kinds of problems around what the public knows and doesn't know about it, and we know that about everything, right? I mean, we know that about lead screening, we know it about the obesity problem in the US, so we shouldn't be surprised that this is a difficult thing to educate toward. I think it's going to have to be multifaceted, and a partnership between the consumers, the consumer groups that are interested, the media, the providers, et cetera, and it's going to have to come from many, many angles. I also think at these moments in history, we always get very anxious and worried, and, you know, we're all going to die because 23andMe exists and it shouldn't, and everybody's going to be leaping off of bridges because they have their genome in their hand. That didn't happen. You know, Robert Greene's studies on Alzheimer's testing showed people didn't go crazy. They just bought more insurance, which may or may not be a good thing. So I think we also have to sort of take a deep breath and say, what is actually happening here? It's really important to have these conversations with multiple stakeholders. And then I think we need to have multiple ways of giving this information to women. They said over and over, the women in the focus groups, don't give me this stuff when I'm pregnant and I'm hormonal and I'm crazy, and give me this stuff when I'm thinking about becoming pregnant. And then you go back to, well, should we be doing this in high school, and how many young women are thinking about what they want to think about when they're the complexity in the social construct of thinking about this is difficult. And the other thing I think we haven't brought up a lot in this meeting is the diversity of communities, that we find different communities have different sensitivities to information like this, and we haven't really accounted for that as different populations are concentrated in different areas. So that was really amorphous and gray, but that's because this, at least we find, is really amorphous and gray, and we're going to have to use multiple kinds of ways of dealing with it.
I agree, and I think most of the Down syndrome organizations believe that we need to educate pre-pregnant America, and many of them have developed kind of campaigns to do so, but it all comes down to money at the end of the day, because one ad in New York Times and your whole budget's gone. If you want to have a beautiful commercial that's prime time on ABC, it'll take 2 years worth of budget to do it. So all of the major national Down syndrome organizations have a limited budget, and therefore their outreach to do what you're describing is very limited.
So probably the #1 Down syndrome education tool right now is Glee. Because if you don't watch Glee, Sue Sylvester, the sort of mean coach, has a sister with Down syndrome who just died in the show last season, and also has a friend, a student who has Down syndrome who's now captain of the cheerleaders or something. So although I don't think they're downplaying the complications of the disease because her sister did die, I think that young America is getting educated a lot through that show.
I've known Mildred long enough that I'm going to jump the queue on her, in part because I want to put Will on the spot. You guys have been ignoring Will in favor of Sharon and Brian largely. So Will, and to a lesser extent, Jaime. Over 40% of the births in this country are paid for by Medicaid. Medicaid is a joint state-federal program. I can certainly imagine a number of states deciding that they would not pay for NIPT because NIPT will lead to more abortions, and the states are pro-life states. Any thoughts on that from the two of you?
Oh, you said the two of you.
I know, it's easy.
I thought about that. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical. You're a degree removed from the abortion debate at this point. Now you're talking about testing. How would the bill be written? Would it be written you can't have the abortion after? They already do that.
No, the bill would be written that Oklahoma's Medicaid program will not pay for the test.
Because the test might be used for that?
It says it will not pay for the test. It doesn't give a reason.
I would be shocked. I could be wrong. I would be shocked if I cannot, and look, I spent a lot of time, I wrote a book where I went to Louisiana, Utah states, really deeply pro-life states. I still cannot see them outlawing funding for a test that might be used for abortion when you can easily put on the air, if you had a big budget, a couple of families talking about how having this test really helped us prepare for having this wonderful child that we have, or something like that.
What you find is that most states already do pay for amniocentesis and will pay for prenatal genetic screening. I think it's like 38 to 40 states pay for amnio. So that might argue in favor of what you're suggesting.
Interesting that 10 to 12 don't.
Yeah, no, it is. And so with NIPT, you could see them saying, we're just not going to cover this because it's screening and it's not additional, and if you want to have an amnio, you can, and that might be sort of a subversive way of doing it. But I think that as the technology catches on and they realize that it might be less expensive to use this technology as opposed to other things, depending on how the technology itself rolls out, the majority of states already do.
Sorry, Jaime, do you know, I don't know about those 10 to 12 states. Do you know anything about the states that don't fund it, the amnio, why they don't?
I don't know why they don't. And I can't off the top of my head tell you what those 12 states are, but I did research for it for the recent paper that I wrote, so I know that I checked those numbers. So yeah.
But,
Back to you, Mildred, with apologies. Not many apologies, but.
Mildred Cho, Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. I just wanted to let you know, Will, that we actually just finished a survey of, I wouldn't call it the general public, but is the internet accessed general public. So we were trying to get a segment of something as close to the general public as we could get. We're still slogging through the data.
Oh, come on.
And, well, no, we really are. and Lauren Sayers and Megan Elise helped on this, as well as other people at our center, and they can truly tell you it's a slog. Jump in if there's anything you want to say about it. But I do think that as a comparison with other people who have been studied in this context, which has mostly been people who have been in clinic populations or families with disease, with that as a sort of comparison group. Tell me if you don't agree or if you have anything else to say, but my sense is that they were not as interested in prenatal testing as I thought they would be. I mean, I was surprised, that was something that surprised me. There was a lot less sort of gung-ho-ness about it. I mean, if you listen to the companies, they're just all, you know, everyone's gonna get this and they're going to beat our doors down and all that.
That's the general population?
Yes.
But on the other side, were they gung-ho against it? Did they have any issues either way, or were they just apathetic?
No, it was, as you said, there was very strong support for the availability of testing, even though there were a fairly large percentage that said, I wouldn't use it. But then if you say, well, this test should be available because nobody has the right to interfere with a woman's right to get testing, for instance, other than sort of evangelical Christians, you saw a really high support for those sort of libertarian statements. So I think Mildred's right. I think it's a smaller percentage you see like actively. This is our second survey. We have another one where we asked people actively, are you going to do this test? And fewer people than I think we were expecting actually said they would do it, but most of them, like 80% plus, said, of course it should be available.
Mm-hmm. So I think that supports your idea that people can compartmentalize sort of termination, testing, and even other people testing versus me testing, right? So that people are pretty, you know, they're pretty...
In polling, we learned to ask the question that way. What would your neighbors vote for a Mormon? Then
right,
that'll
or
tell
that,
you the honest
you know,
answer.
if someone else wants to do it, yeah, if someone else wants to do it, that's okay, but I'm not going to do it. But people can separate those things. Yeah. So I think that was, in some ways, reassuring.
Last two questions before the break. Not to put any pressure on you to make your answers short.
I wanted to make a comment in response to the critique of the Understanding book, which I had nothing to do with creating, by the way. But I do appreciate it because I have to say, as a genetic counselor looking for information to give to patients, really what's out there, if you're looking at what ACOG has out available or what March of Dimes has available, or what the laboratories that are putting the testing out have available, it's not really great information, you know, and I think that it's pretty admirable to try to find a consensus that takes into account both the disability advocacy, the parent advocacy, patient advocacy, and the medical community, and it's not easy. There's not going to be like a real great solution that's going to make everybody totally happy, but the reality is, like, really, I'm doing a survey of genetic counselors that work in prenatal settings right now, just asking what they use for teaching tools with patients in prenatal counseling, and have been surprised to see very few genetic counselors use photographs at all. Like, really, the comfort zone for genetic counselors in talking about any of these conditions is a picture of a karyotype. Everybody uses a picture of a karyotype. I'd say the general public usually has no idea what that means, but people are very uncomfortable with even using photographs of people with the conditions that they're offering testing for, and I think that's pretty shocking. But a long way to go, lots of compromise, but really I think that we're getting some good resources out there little by little, so that's all.
Thank you.
And my name is Stephanie Meredith, and just in the interest of disclosure for that, I'm the author of Understanding a Down Syndrome Diagnosis and the co-author of Diagnosis to Delivery, which is available on downsyndromepregnancy.org, and I am also the mother of a 12-year-old son with Down syndrome, so that is, and a professional writer, so that's how I come into this. And just to kind of comment to the genesis of how the information in the book was developed. Originally, it was written and then presented to these different groups for their feedback. And we actually did have a full range of medical professionals from different disciplines, between genetic counselors, geneticists, OBGYNs, maternal fetal medicine specialists, and got their input, and also a full range of people from the advocacy community in different capacities of parenting. But I think some of the things I wanted to point out is, particularly for the photos, we actually interviewed all of the families before we took photos of their children to find out what the interests were. And we went on, and all of the photos were taken on location at their, that literally is the girls' dance class. It literally is, neighborhood kids on the bikes. And we took those pictures on location. Now, those kids were not, they weren't selected because they were particularly high functioning. There is one boy in there who's nonverbal. Half of those children did have heart conditions. There's, children who have hearing impairments. Those are reflected in those pictures, but it's also not necessarily reflected. And those are explained in the verbiage in the book as we talk about medical conditions and all of those things that are available, but it's not necessarily reflective when you see them in their daily activities. And I think it's important to remember, too, that there has been such tremendous progress, and this was something that all of the national organizations could agree on, is that there's been such tremendous progress over the past 30 years in access to health care, education. I mean, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act wasn't passed until 1975. So you have a great deal of progress in the past 30 years in that particular community for outcomes. And that actually spans the spectrum of disabilities in that progress with ADA and all the different access to resources. So I think that does inform that process. But thank you so much for your input and your perspective. Thank you.
Well, it's time for a break. Join me in thanking this panel.